It's like a little bit of a sugar high, getting someone with a huge name. And it acts as like a shortcut to convince less sophisticated people that it is credible. Whether those less sophisticated people are investors who are just looking for brand names that they can attach themselves to, or perhaps employees. But the big names rarely, very rarely, are the people that will want to roll up their sleeves and really lean in.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Ryan Caldbeck, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Dune, a powerful analytics platform for blockchain research. It can be used to query, extract, and visualize vast amounts of data on Ethereum blockchain. Ryan was previously the founder and CEO of CircleUp, a technology platform focused on finding and evaluating private companies. He's also an angel investor in several high-growth technology companies. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the role of independent directors at startups, how to find them and work with them, how they can mediate between other board directors like the investors and the CEO, and when and how long to bring them on at a startup. We also do a deep dive into the topic of building trust, not only with the independent directors, but also with other members of the startups like employees, co-founders, board of directors, and others. I first came across Ryan on Twitter, where he used to write very thoughtfully about various subjects, mostly around startups. He is one of those most sincere, down-to-earth, and clear thinkers that I know of. I love his way of thinking, especially how he builds and uses frameworks to evaluate various topics. For those who don't, I highly recommend following Ryan on Twitter at Ryan_Caldbeck, and also on his webpage, ryancaldbeck.co. Independent directors is a subject that I heard about, but haven't seen too many of, even in my own close circles, have any. So I thought it could be a very useful topic for the listeners. I really enjoyed learning from Ryan, and I'm very sure you'll find this conversation very helpful. All right, Ryan, thank you for doing this. I don't know if you remember, but the first time I reached out to you via email, admiring your thoughtful tweets, when you kindly accepted to meet me for lunch, that was just before COVID, and everything shut down after that. So we didn't ever meet in person, and I'm glad I'm talking to you today. Thanks for doing this.
It's wonderful to talk with you now. And I wish we had gotten lunch, and I hope we will be able to in the future.
I'm counting on that. Well, this again is based on one of your thoughtful tweet storms about independent directors for startups. I think it makes sense to start this conversation by defining who independent directors are.
So oftentimes a startup will form a board of directors. Not always, but often. And a board of directors is typically made up of the major investors in the company and the founders who represent the common shares. The major investors, each round, so if you raise a Series A, oftentimes the lead investor in the Series A will get a board seat, lead investor in Series B, et cetera, will get board seats. Sometimes those investors roll off, but they typically represent their share class. So for example, those that invested in the Series A are represented by the Series A board member. And then the common is typically represented by the founders who have a board seat as well. What I've seen be really successful is also adding an independent board member. An independent board member is typically someone that does not have a bias towards either the investors or the founders in this case. Doesn't lean one way or another. They're typically compensated with common shares, but the intention around an independent board member is to help facilitate conversation, to help make the board meetings more constructive, to help the relationship between the founders and the investors be more fruitful, and to also be a wonderful thought partner for the CEO and the founders. And so the way that looks is it's often someone who has prior relevant experience as an operator. It's pretty rare to have an investor as an independent board member. And so that operator could take a couple different forms. Maybe it is a prior CEO who ran a somewhat similar company, but is a couple of years ahead of you. Or it could be someone with some functional experience. Maybe it's domain experience like SaaS, or maybe it's functional experience like marketing or finance or ops, whatever it is. And the independent board member then will act as a regular board member, have a voting say, just as other board members do. And I've found that the dynamic of having someone who doesn't lean either towards the investors or towards the founders to be a really, really valuable thing for the company.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think you bring up a lot of points. We'll go down each of those threads in a minute. But what role do they play exactly on the board governance? You said they have common stock as opposed to preferred stock that the Series A or other investors have. Is that any different in terms of governance?
A couple different things. First, there's one, we reference the stock. That's kind of how we compensate the independent director, right? So sometimes for larger companies, they will get paid in cash as well, particularly public companies. But I think in this podcast, we're mainly focused on startups. So let's assume that we're talking about companies with Series Seed to Series C as in cat. For those, they are very rarely compensated with cash. It is much more common for them to be compensated with options. And so you'd typically grant options to the independent board member that vest over a period of time. Most common I've seen is kind of vesting over 2 years in that case, whereas an employee will probably invest over 4 years typically. So that's how we compensate them. And then there's some incentive alignment that person is now incentivized to grow the company just as we are. It's not perfect in terms of alignment because they don't have preferred. They only have common in terms of alignment with the investors, but investors are more than okay with that. Then in terms of the governance that they have, it really depends on the company itself. They will typically have a vote at the board meeting if things come down to votes, which by the way, they very, very rarely come down to votes in all practicality. Sometimes they're asked to join committees. The most common I've seen is that the independent board member is asked to join a compensation committee to help determine the founder's comp and help to sign off on the team's compensation. That's usually pretty good governance. You wouldn't want just the common board members to determine their own comp. And having only the investor determine it sometimes is a bit of a, not quite conflict of interest, but it's a bit wonky sometimes. So you want the independent usually on there as well. So the governance, yes, they have a vote if things come down to a vote. Typically, they don't. More realistically, what happens is they have a fiduciary responsibility to dig in and to pay attention and engage actively. And on top of that, they will sometimes sit on committees.
Who asks them to sit on the committees? Like, is it the CEO who asks them to do that or the rest of the board?
It depends on the dynamics. I always ask our independents to sit on the compensation committee. I've seen that most common, but sometimes, particularly in contentious situations, a investor will sometimes step in because they'll realize that this independent board member can really do a great job of playing a more neutral role. It's just less fiery than it might be if the investor tried to have the exact same conversation. And so sometimes the investors will ask that the independent step in.
How do you find these people? It seems like they have a special DNA where you're not biased towards CEO or the board. How do they stay level-headed? And where can we find them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So independent board members, there are probably some watch outs first. So watch out for the independent board members that your investors might suggest to you. And the reason is not because they don't trust the investors, but they typically have a prior existing relationship. And if they have a prior existing relationship, then for that independent board member, it's probably a repeated game with the investor, but a one-off game with you. And that's not a great place to be. And similarly, the investor should be wary if you suggest someone that you've known for 20 years. You really want someone who's relatively independent. Then I'd say, I'm just a big fan of the quote, if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. So define what you're looking for, right? What do you want help with? My wife, who was a former CMO at Coursera, just joined a public board because they wanted someone with a marketing background. They went out, they wanted someone with a marketing background, they found it. You also, instead of wanting someone with a marketing background, might want someone with an education background, an ed tech background. Or you might want someone who's just a general CEO because you may be a first-time CEO. And so having someone who can coach you and work with you on what it's like to be a CEO, the emotional roller coaster, but also just the types of issues that only other CEOs and operators really understand. And so first is just defining it. I'd recommend writing out a job description, frankly. Write out what you're looking for and why. Share that with the board. Share that with the current investors. Share that with your co-founder. Are you roughly aligned? If so, then let's make a list of where to find that. Typically look for people that are kind of 5 to 10 years ahead of where you are. Don't look for someone that's 30 years ahead. those are people that are kind of out of touch in terms of what you're dealing with. Getting Mark Zuckerberg on your Series A board, it's going to be pretty tough for him to add a lot of real world value, to be frank. It's not because he's not brilliant, just he hasn't dealt with that in a very long time. So I think you want someone who's a bit ahead of you, but not too far ahead. I think you also really want to build a relationship to make sure that there is mutual trust. How do you evaluate trust in someone else? Well, everyone's got different styles there, but the independent board member, you want to have mutual trust between you and that person and between that person and the investors. Doesn't mean that you'll always agree. In fact, you shouldn't always agree, but you want to have a framework for how you'll evaluate trust. I have, and I've talked about this publicly before on Twitter, I have a framework that I talk about trust, which is trust equals credibility times reliability times authenticity. So credibility is just, do you do what you say you will do? If a Series A type CEO comes in and says, all right, I want an independent board member who has a great marketing background, and then they bring in someone that doesn't have any marketing background, it's going to be hard to build trust. That person is not credible. The next variable in the trust equation is reliability. Do they do what they say they will do? This, I think, is particularly important for independent board members because oftentimes it's easy to get seduced by someone with a big name who then won't show up in terms of being present, or actually literally won't show up to meetings. And so how can you have enough reps with this person to know that they're reliable? They'll respond to your emails, they'll engage. And the last one is just authenticity. Do you feel like you can be authentic with this person? I found it to be really helpful to know that I could be vulnerable with the independent board members that I've worked with. I've been an investor on boards and operator boards and been an independent on boards. And in each case, when I've had other board members and independents that I could be vulnerable and authentic with, and them to me, that increased the trust in the relationship tremendously. And so those are some of the soft things that I would look for as well. In terms of how you find it then, when you've made the list of like that criteria, now it's a matter of going out and networking, frankly. And so in both of our cases, when we brought on independent board members, when I was CEO of CircleUp, it was defining it for myself and for the board, what we want, then going out to pools where those types of people play, frankly. Networking with other investors of ours that weren't on the board, but I thought would have a perspective on who might be relevant, or meeting with other founders and people in and around the spaces that I cared about, asking them for recommendations and just beginning to triangulate to the right person.
I like your framework, looking for credibility, reliability, and authenticity. Maybe give an example of how you picked your own for CircleUp, the kind of specific questions you asked. Let me take a step back. I think what is important here is understanding your shortcomings. If you're a CEO, try to write down what you need. And then once you figure that out, go out and network. And maybe have a specific example of how you actually pick one, especially when this is a second or a third degree connection. How you look for the credibility, reliability, and authenticity aspects of it. Background checks. It's a hard process, I'm guessing. Any stories will be helpful.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is I don't know that it's realistic that most startups can just pick the independent board member. There is a mutual dating process where both sides need to opt in, especially if this is someone who is phenomenally talented, right? Just as if you're going to hire an A+ engineer, you don't just pick them. You have to sell them just as much as evaluate them. And so I don't know that I ever interviewed independent board members in a way that they thought they were being interviewed. I don't think I did. I think it was more having conversations with them and just sharing, this is what we're working on. This is what we're doing. Are they engaging? Are they meeting my bid when I'm demonstrating some vulnerability of like, hey, I'm not sure how to handle this over here. This is something that I'm really struggling with. Is that something that they gravitate towards or against? When I would ask them about experience that they had that were similar, or experiences that they had where they struggled, were they open to talking about that? Or if it's just constantly like deflect, I remember one conversation, it was a lot about, let's just talk about the metrics. Let's just talk about the metrics. It's like, I care about metrics. I can do that with my current board though. And that's not only the only thing I'm looking at right now. That wasn't how I defined what I wanted. Just another person to talk to me about metrics, because I knew that. And I thought I was very good at that. Like I wanted someone else to help me with other parts of the job. But this person I was talking to, this independent board member I was talking to, who I didn't end up pursuing, didn't want to go after. And so I don't think it's an interview. I think it's a lot about like having an authentic conversation that's going to look very similar to what you want if they join that day as an independent board member. What would you want to talk with them about? What would you want to share? How would you want them to react? Then I think another component, and I probably use this a lot also in just interviewing in general, is just, are they interested? Are they passionate about it? Do they follow up? When you follow up with them, Do they take a week and a half to respond with one sentence, or are they jumping back and they're really engaged? I remember there's an advisor we thought very hard about bringing on as a board member, and we didn't because he had some conflicts. But I remember I had an amazing conversation with him. And a week later, I got a call from someone in New York saying, hey, this person is at a conference talking about your company in a really positive way. Probably a pretty good sign that this guy's engaged. He cares. And yeah, I want some people that care around the table. I'll contrast that with a mistake that I often see from entrepreneurs, which is like, let's just get the biggest name possible. And I can think of at least one catastrophic example where that biggest name possible was not engaged, and that caused some major problems for the company after it went public. You really want someone who meets the criteria as I just laid out, but also how are you judging that this is something that they really want to spend time on, not just for the money, but because they care about your mission. Talk about your mission, talk about your vision. Are they aligned with the values of the company? You want to talk about all those things explicitly, just as you would with a potential employee.
Yeah, all great points. I think vulnerability and how they respond to that, and are they being vulnerable? That's something I've seen really help me in the past, and how passionate they are. That is another point. The big name, that's a problem, especially in our deep tech space. We are scientists and trying to become credible. We slap name of a big scientist, like there's a Nobel laureate, and they seem to be appear on everybody's deck. And we think that is making us credible. I think people need to move away from that and look at that short-term gain in terms of how they can help you grow.
It's like a little bit of a sugar high, getting someone with a huge name, and it acts as like a shortcut to convince less sophisticated people that it is credible. Whether those less sophisticated people are investors who are just looking for brand names that they can attach themselves to, or perhaps employees, but the big names rarely, very rarely are the people that will want to roll up their sleeves and really lean in. There's also examples, Theranos probably the most famous of all time, of companies that, would bring on people that like have no idea what the company's doing. It's just a big name. And by the way, not only do they not have any idea what the company's doing, the big name is completely disconnected from what the company does. It's just a big name. That was meant to, I think, obfuscate the core issues. Like, well, you trust that person, even though he's a five-star general, has no idea what we do, but just trust over there. Well, that person can't help. And it just depends on what kind of business you want to build. Do you want to build a real business where you have a thought partner to help you grow? Or you just want a name? And if you just want a name, I think it's good to just take a step back and think through why. What are you trying to accomplish with that? I don't know if I've ever seen in my life where that big name ends up being something that the founders are happy that they did.
Speaking of help, I think in one of your tweets, you said a strong independent director can help to unlock conversations that might naturally get stuck between an investor and a founder. Can you give some instances where an independent director helped unlock such conversations in your own case, or if you're acting as an ID independent director, what did you do to help?
The most common example that I've seen, so first of all, let me take a step back. I loved my board. I'm not just saying it, I mean it sincerely. I loved the board that I had. I was extremely fortunate with the investors that we had around the table. So I'm just going to talk about what I've seen both as a board member there and a board member at other companies. I think the most common is related to compensation, but it's not the only one. I think, let me give another example, because that's probably just an obvious one in terms of the investors don't really want to give the CEO a raise. The investors don't really want the CEO to take secondary in the next round. The investors, they just want you to put your head down and crank. The flip side of that is that the CEO has financial needs. For 5-6 years of my time at CircleUp as CEO, I and my wife were selling stock, got holdings in the public markets. We were selling that almost on a monthly basis in order to pay our bills because we were running at a deficit from my salary. And at a certain point, like, that's just not healthy, right? So an independent board member will help unlock some of those kind of conversations. I think that the other ones that come to mind, though, I remember there were some strategy questions where investors I've seen have gotten extremely passionate. Passionate because they're smart, they're experienced, they have a ton of pattern recognition, and they think that they're right. On the flip side, they spend 1/3 of their time on their existing portfolio and probably 10% of that time on your portfolio, on your company. So they spend less than 3% of their time-ish, ballpark, or about that, on your company. And you spend 100% of your time in your company. So that is going to naturally lead to some conflicts about what should we do in this case, strategy. And sometimes if investors really care, there'll be passionate conflicts. An independent board member who cares and is skillful can help to bridge those conversations, to make them more constructive and to take some of the heat out. if that makes sense. So they can hear what you're saying and then bring it over to the CEO and talk about it in a calmer way and can kind of mediate that, in my experience, in a really, really effective way. So it depends, though. These are the types of things that you want to talk about with the independent board member. The flip side is the independent board member that, going back to the concept of repeated games, the independent board member that is looking for more jobs with that VC firm, that's a mole. That's someone who was kind of in the pocket of the VCs, and that's not productive. It just isn't. Not because your VCs or the independent is trying to be unethical. It's just they have a role to play, but they can't play that role if they actually have bias.
Yeah, very important point. Along those lines, what it seems like is that I have observed this as well in terms of giving feedback, whether it is the investors or the board members giving feedback to the CEO, or the CEO giving the feedback to the investors, or somebody who's mediating here. What can we do to improve this relation of giving feedbacks so that it's a more productive relation? What worked in your cases or your observations?
I think it takes a lot of courage on both sides. I don't think this is obvious to most CEOs, but I think it takes courage for the investor to give the CEO feedback, just as I think it takes courage for the CEO to give the investors feedback. And similar with the independent board members too. But I've seen so many investors that are earlier in their career. They haven't had 10 huge wins. And look, they get a reputation for being not founder friendly. Their career's over. It just doesn't work. They know that. And they don't want to rock the boat too much, especially if they don't think you're going to listen. It's easier for them to just go back to their partnership and talk about, well, he's just bullheaded and he won't listen. I think it takes courage and skill from the investor to talk to and give feedback to the CEO. And I also think it takes courage from the CEO to do it. And so how do you do that? And you think about just in your life, when do you have the courage to give someone else feedback? Whether it's because they have something in their teeth. I mean, it's funny. I saw my nephew who's 7 yesterday, and he gave me feedback. I was at a goddaughter's graduation, and he gave me feedback that I had something in my teeth. That takes some courage to do. I mean, how many adults do we know that won't do that? Well, how do you do that? How do you build that relationship? I think it's a lot about trust. And how do you build trust with your investors and your independents? Well, I think a few ways. One is if you show up just to the board meeting and your relationship ends at the end of the board meeting, it's not much of a relationship. That's a transaction. On the other side, can you invest into a dinner the night before the night of a board meeting? Can you invest into doing an hour-long call with each board member in between each board meeting? Apart from the things you might also be tackling, a dedicated call where you're checking in with them so that they're not surprised, which leads to another component of the trust equation, reliability. Someone's surprised. Think about your relationships when you feel surprised. You thought your wife was going to show up at 5 and she showed up at 5:30. Or, you thought she was going to do X or pick the kids up. She didn't, decided not to pick them up. Lowers trust real quick. Another component there related to authenticity is it goes back to telling somebody they got something in their teeth. So starting off with giving some feedback, showing them that you're welcoming of feedback. I think this is something that CEOs don't do a great job of often, is demonstrating that they are open and want the feedback. And how can you talk to the investors so they feel safe to give you that? How was this for you? How was this meeting for you? What worked? What didn't work? What should I have done differently? What do you wish that I had done differently in my communication with you? What do you wish that I had done differently in my communication with the team or the strategy? What other thoughts do you have for me? And it takes time to build that relationship where they will open up, but I think it's critical. And similarly, you have to have the courage to give them feedback. I've had to give each of our board members feedback that was pretty tough at times, but in each case, I think we had the relationship that allowed them to know there's coming from a place of care and love, and they said they appreciated it. But it takes some time to get there.
Yeah, I think being sincere in terms of accepting that feedback and expressing it to the other person is important. I hope this relation starts that way from the beginning so that it's a more positive experience. Otherwise, there seem to be just power dynamics. Investors have the upper hand, and sometimes I'm sure some of the VCs can exploit other board members to side with them on contentious board issues. How can we keep independent directors away from that? Any thoughts on that?
That I think is a really difficult dynamic when you start to see board members lobbying in private. And I've also seen it the flip side where one investor will come to me in private and say, hey, I disagreed with that other investor. I just didn't want to say it in the meeting. And that begins to not only be a huge time suck, but be extremely counterproductive for group dynamics.
Emotional drain.
It's an emotional drain. It robs the first investor of hearing the feedback. It robs you and the company of witnessing a probably fruitful debate. It forces you to make a decision in private where one side will not understand all the information and you can't share all the information unless you get them to talk directly. And so I found it to be extremely counterproductive. In each instance that has happened, I've said to the investor, I really need you to talk about this in public, meaning in the board meeting. I need you to talk about this with the other investor in the room, or else we can't do this. And it's a kind of a similar philosophy that I've had as a CEO, which is whenever I've had an employee come to me about another employee, the first question is always, have you talked to them? If not, why not? Can we get them in the room right now? Can we talk about it together? If you two can't talk by yourselves, well, I will join or we'll have someone from HR join. But you talking to me and complaining about that person when that person isn't in the room, I don't think is productive. And it's hard. It's not always a fit. And so there have been cases where it has continued to not be a fit. And then you are forced to make a really difficult choice, which is, should I look to part ways with one of the board members? And contractually, that's not always that easy. You led the Series C, you have often the right to a board seat to represent that share class. This is also where an independent can play an interesting role of talking to the person saying, these dynamics aren't working out. Can we replace you with someone else at the company, at your firm? Are you willing to take a step off? And so those are options to have that type of conversation, but it's difficult.
Speaking of replacing a board member or getting rid of one of them, how hard is it once you appoint an independent director?
How hard is it to get rid of the independent?
Yeah.
It depends why, right? So if you're getting rid of the independent because they're voting against your compensation, that's not a good look. Maybe you should take a look in the mirror if the independent and the board and the investors don't want you to have that increase. If you're getting rid of them because there's just a style dynamic issue or they're not adding value, that's usually a lot easier. First of all, any independent worth their salt doesn't want to be on there just for money. They want to be on there because they want to add value. They want to be part of building something special. And if they're not adding value, usually they will know it. It's just a matter of you having the courage to have the conversation. I probably in those cases recommend talking with your investors as well about it and saying, like, how do you feel? I don't think this is going well. Talking with the independent. First of all, identifying why it's not going well. Are they not engaged? Are they not reading up about the company? Are they not following along? In the meetings, are they having conversations or comments that are completely off topic because they don't understand what's going on? You have to have a lot of difficult conversations as a CEO, and that's one of them.
Very difficult conversations. I hope it doesn't come to that for most people. Thought I'd ask. But I want to go back to something you mentioned about trust. It might be a much broader question, but I feel it is related here. But how does one build trust? Maybe you can take some of an example from your own experience, how you've built that trust, whether it is with the board or independent directors.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm really kind of geeky about this, frankly. I think trust has played a really important role in my life. And I think other people's lives as well. Obviously, that's a silly comment, but in my life, it has profoundly impacted some relationships that I've had where someone may have broken trust or done something that broke trust with me. And so I really tried to understand, how can you talk about trust without it being nuclear? When you say, I don't trust you, it's really hard to come back for that from either side. I find this equation that I talk about to be one way to have a conversation about trust without it being nuclear. Because now, if we can focus on the reliability component of trust, I think that's less charged than if we focus on saying, I don't trust you. I'll give you a real example. The company I'm at right now, Dune, we are fully remote. And I said to a candidate that we're recruiting to hire last week, he asked me about the culture. I said, look, I think the people here are super high integrity. And I think organizationally, trust is an issue. And let me explain why. It's not because anyone has low integrity. They are very high integrity. Problem when you are fully remote across time zones is that the only way to talk is typically when you calendar a meeting. When you calendar a meeting, it feels more transactional. I can't just walk out the door to grab a coffee, even if it's just for a 5-minute walk with any colleagues this month. And because of that, it's harder to talk about my weekend or my kids or ask them about the movie that they saw or other things like that. Just the nature of that type of interaction is just harder. And we are working as a company of what can we do about that? How can we build some authenticity? That's the authenticity, vulnerability variable of the trust equation. And those types of interactions help to build that. When you ask me, like, how do I build trust? Looking at each of those components to say, all right, well, what can I do? So let's go through it. I wanted to work in Web3, in crypto. Let's go through the trust equation. Well, first is just credibility. Okay, why do I have any credibility in Web3? Well, I've been an investor in it for a long time. Doesn't give me a lot. A lot of people are an investor in it. Doesn't mean that they should be operating in it. Okay, what else? And that led me to go down a path of building in Web3, of taking courses in Web3, of having hundreds of hours of conversation in Web3, blogging about it, et cetera. And that work helped to build a little bit of credibility. Not a ton, but a bit more than the average person who just invests in Web3. The next is reliability. How do I build reliability with the people that I was talking to about being a part of this ecosystem? And how do I demonstrate that I can do what I say I will do? And so part of that is talking to them about the problems and opportunities that I see in the space, but also talking to them like, this is how I would solve it. This is what I would do. This is how I've solved it in the past in related situations to help demonstrate reliability. And then the third is just authenticity. Also sharing with them, there's so much stuff that I don't know. And I know I don't know it. And this is why that's scary for me. And this is why I feel insecure about that. But some of that language helps to demonstrate some vulnerability. Those three different things, just you can kind of see like build a bit of trust. Not amazing trust, but a bit. And then you get in the room and you try and build more with those three variables in mind. So that's kind of how I think about it.
I really like that framework. I'm actually going through a similar startup. And my next startup that I'm going through is a food space. And I'm trying to tell people how they can trust me. And you gave me some good talking points and to think about. And I think there's nothing better than building them and showing them, actually showing them a prototype that I can actually do this and tell them related stories that how we've solved similar problems in a different area. Because I was a chemical biologist. I built hardware afterwards. I hope that'll give some trust to people. I think drawing examples really helps.
It's funny, it's such a cliche term, but like the concept of you build trust in inches and you lose it in miles. It takes time. And think about the ways that you interact with the person you're trying to build trust with. Waiting 4 days to respond to their message probably doesn't increase trust. Showing up 8 minutes late to the meeting doesn't increase trust. I've got two colleagues. One showed up 25 minutes late to a meeting with the other, and that hurts trust. This happened last week. Yeah, that hurts trust. So that's the reliability component. But similarly, on the credibility side, this is an important thing for especially managers. Your teammate will talk about like, well, I want you to trust me to go do X when they have no experience doing X. And so you need to be able to verbalize, well, let's talk about what that means. You're asking me to trust your credibility in doing X when you have never done X. How could you build that credibility with me? Can you talk about how you do X? Can you lay out a plan? Could you show me that you've taken a class on the side and learning how to do X, or what some analogies are, et cetera, et cetera. There are different ways to get to that point without only having to do it. But having the conversation about the credibility component in that example, I think is valuable.
Excellent point. I'd like to slightly shift gear and talk something more fundamental. This again from one of your tweets. You said, not everyone agrees that a startup should have an independent. What are the general objections that you've seen or heard about from those who oppose independence?
Independence, a couple of things. First, it is often hard to get an independent that is truly independent. If the person is successful and well-connected, they probably do care more about their relationship with your VCs than they do you. And there are dynamics there that are difficult to manage, to be frank. So some people would disagree with having an independent in part because of that concept. Then they end up becoming something that looks like a mole, even if they don't intend to be a mole. Now you're reading, wait, do you really believe that? Or are you just saying that because you want to agree with the investor who said that last week? I think that's one reason. Another reason is it's easy to have an independent, when an independent gives you advice or weighs in, it's easy, particularly for first-time CEOs, to just take that as gospel. That independent thinks about your business even less than the 3% I mentioned before that the investor thinks about it. While they have options in the company, they don't have any skin in the game. They didn't put their job on the line to do this. And so they might be weighing in with some thoughts that are just not relevant. And it's easy for first-time CEOs to take that as gospel. That can lead you down a really difficult path because now the investor may recognize, hey, this is not good advice. This is not something you should be listening to. And now, do you listen to them? Kind of beings play like mind tricks with you. Do you listen to them? Or how do you handle this? That's part of it. I think another frame here is going back to what you want from the independent. So I don't think that an independent should always be a management coach. You should have a management coach on your own. Sometimes people view an independent as a management coach. And your ability to differentiate and get clarity on what you want from the role is pretty vital. And many CEOs are not able to do that. They're not able to kind of think through like, what is the specific thing that I need here? And when it begins to be amorphous of like, well, I kind of want to coach, I kind of want this, that's when you're setting yourself and the independent up for failure.
Yeah, that's a difficult conundrum, I think, especially when you bring on an independent and they lead you down a different path. How do you cut down the signal from the noise there? What worked for you?
To find the right one?
For example, if they give you an advice of trying something else, what kind of process goes on in your head of whether to follow or not to follow through and how to push back?
I think this is probably the hardest part of being a founder and CEO that I never hear anyone talking about. I'm not saying it's the hardest part. I'm saying it's probably the hardest part that I never hear anyone talking about, which is part of the reason you were able to start the company and be CEO is because other people did not think it was a great idea. If they did, they would have started it. And there are some signals that you were right. You were able to raise money. You got a little bit of traction. You hired a team, whether that's 5 people or 5,000 people. You got a little bit of traction, which kind of enforces this concept of, oh, people disagreed with me. I was right. Okay, I'm going to keep trusting my gut here. Whether that's the gut of, I don't need to wear shoes to the office or put on deodorant, or the gut of what to do with the strategy, even if everyone else is telling me they disagree. And now when you think about dealing with that with a board member, that same thing comes up where they may have a different viewpoint. They may want you to do something else. And how do you know when to listen to them versus not? I think that's the most difficult balancing act that you have, part of the job that you have as a founder and CEO that no one talks about. So I don't have great advice for you other than I really try and often fail to listen to a variety of points of view and then try to take my emotion out of it and just lay them out in front of me. If I think someone's wrong, well, can I articulate really effectively why I think they're wrong? Do I have more experience in that space? Do I have more data in that space? Okay, now the independent board member is saying something that's consistent with what my head of sales is saying, which is consistent with what 3 top customers have said, which is consistent with what the investors said. Got to have a lot of data to disagree with that.
It's a very difficult one.
It is. I am someone who actively seeks out alternative opinions because I like, and my co-founder, CircleUp, and I used to do this, I think, pretty well. We would purposely take opposite sides of an argument. We would play devil's advocate to each other. And in the meeting, we would often switch sides and get to the point where we wouldn't even talk about it. We just switch sides to make each other's argument. And that's how we fleshed it. I remember when we were coming up with the idea, one of the things I did was I called one of the best short sellers in the country, a hedge fund guy that shorted companies, meaning he bet that the company would go down. The short sellers are notoriously negative people. They will tear apart your idea extremely effectively. And I did it to have him tear apart the idea so I could hear, and he was one of the best at like tearing it apart. And I still started the company in part because I thought logical reasons and data on why he was wrong in his hour-long assessment. But oftentimes when I was working with investors or board members, I would end up agreeing with them. And I would try and listen, but again, not always successfully. It's a hard balancing act.
I think you bring up some important points. One is taking the emotion out, because as a founder, you probably spend the most amount of time, a lot more than the advisors or directors, and then taking the alternative opinions from other people. Once you take the emotions out and articulating it is really important, trying to explain things back to those directors why you think otherwise. I think that's good framework there.
Going back to like what you're looking for in investors, I am just a big fan of using frameworks of mission, vision, strategy, values. Those frameworks, I think, are really helpful for determining who we hire, for determining things like the product roadmap, what customers we work with, our projections, OKRs, et cetera. And when we talk about working with investors or board members or independent board members, aligning up front, does this mission resonate with you? Talking about your values and trying to see like if these values are things that this person has demonstrated and how they've demonstrated. And is this something that really resonates? The company's vision, the company's strategy. You should expect that there'll probably be some differences on strategy, but if there's differences on mission, vision, or values, that's usually a bad sign. So those are kind of shortcuts that I've found to be helpful in identifying an independent board member.
That's great advice. Moving along, what point do you bring these independent directors? I see a lot of opinions out there. I mean, I was talking to one of my guests here, Rachel Horowitz. She's a CEO of Caribou Biosciences, who went public. And she's like, I waited too long to set up a board, and people should not wait that long. When it comes to independence, what do you think worked for you?
I found around the Series A is a pretty good time to have an independent board member. There's no common metric for all startups. Let's be clear. There are Series A companies with one person. There's companies, WhatsApp, when it sold, had 15 people or 17 people, whatever it was. So we can look at revenue. We can look at the series. We can look at the number of teammates, et cetera. But if we want one broad sweeping generalization, around Series A. The company probably doesn't have great product market fit, but has a little bit of revenue. It doesn't have 80 people, but it probably has more than 8. And the company is trying to begin to build frameworks and processes for best practices. They're trying to understand that people, process, and norms that they should have in order to get to product market fit in order to scale the company. And the board member that you want at the Series A level is almost certainly different than the one that you want at the Series D. But at that level of Series A, it begins to look more like a real company. And when it's a seed company, and I don't mean to disparage anyone, I miss that stage greatly. But the thing can pivot pretty massively on a weekly basis when it's a seed company. And that's okay. It should. You should keep exploring. That makes it harder for an independent to add as much value. When it's a Series A, it doesn't mean it won't be pivoted as a Series C company. It just more means that it won't do it quite as often. They're probably a little bit more dialed into their strategy. They have a decent sense of their mission, vision, and values as well.
And how many can you have? Is there a limit of how many independent directors you can bring on? Or
it's usually set out in the operating docs that you created with the investor, which is the concept of an independent and how the independent will be elected. So one common framework is that the common would nominate the independent and then the investors would confirm the independent to join the board. And then there's typically a number of board seats that are laid out, including the number of independents. It's usually laid out. If it's not, you can just talk to your investors to have it included. It is a rare investor I have seen that doesn't welcome an independent, provided the independent is truly independent. Then in terms of number, it depends on the company. I found that boards bigger than 5 or 6 people are usually getting to be difficult to manage for companies that are kind of Series C and below. The most common I've seen is 5 people, and it's usually 2 common, 2 investors, and 1 independent. I've seen very few pre-IPO companies with more than 2 independents. That's a rare company. And then in terms of number of board seats altogether, I think the most common feedback you'd get is to have an odd number of board members so that if there's ever a vote, there's not a tie. It is so rare that something comes down to a vote that I typically don't worry about that, but that's what you're going to hear most commonly.
Can you say more about building a relationship with these independent board members? How often do you meet? Any etiquette for that relation?
I try to talk to my independents about once a month, and you should set that as expectations up front. If you just want them to show up at meetings, it's not going to be a great use of your equity or their time. That begins to look more like a superficial brand name relationship. We wanted you for your brand, as opposed to we want you actually helping us. So I usually would set expectations up front. Hey, we probably are going to want 2 to 3 hours a month from you, plus the board meetings. And those are, it's called 4 times a year for 3 to 4 hours each, plus dinners. And so the first step is just setting expectations, making sure that that's aligned. And then in terms of interacting with them, I would usually look to go to them on specific topics, as well as giving them updates, right? So they're going to get the investor updates that you should be sending out every month, but you should also be talking to them about, hey, here's a project that I'm working on that I think you'll be particularly helpful for. How should we think about this reorg? I know you've done that several times. How should we think about this go-to-market strategy? I know you've done that several times. Working to get their feedback on your plan while you're keeping them engaged overall.
Yeah. Can you say more about the timelines? Like, how long do you hold on to these advisors? Because the company is growing. I'm guessing the advice is limited for a certain period of time. You mentioned vesting earlier. What worked?
Most common I've seen is be 2 years. You could keep them on for longer if they want to and you want to. It's more that a good rule of thumb in general, when you're hiring senior leaders, think about, what do I need for that next 18 months? Not because you're going to fire the person in 18 months. But because if you're looking, I want this person to be both great tomorrow and exactly what we need tomorrow, and I want this person to be exactly what we need in 5 years when we're 10 times the size, that's a unicorn. You're just wasting time. You're not going to find that person. This person may grow into that. And similarly, the problems that you're working on right now may be different than they are in 2 years. So you typically would structure it as 2 years and then see if they want to continue the relationship.
I'd like to go back to something you mentioned about management coaches. Can these independent directors be management coaches as well? Like, does it work, or just keep that separate?
Yeah, we're using that term, and I used that term a bit loosely. So it probably makes sense to define it. But I think that being authentic and vulnerable with an independent is helpful for the relationship. I think that's useful. I also think that they play a different role than your management coach. Your management coach is probably going to play a role in terms of some dynamics that are too I don't want to say low level, but candidly, probably too low level for the independent. When you're working on an issue between your VP of product and your head of sales and they're fighting, is it relevant for the independent? It's kind of on the edge. Your management coach is going to be really important for that. When you're working through, I'm really burnt out. I don't know what to do here. I'm really struggling with my burnout and I don't know who to talk to. Talking with that with your management coach and therapist, I think is really important. And some independent board members, it could be valuable as well. That's something that's your judgment. But I found that to be a useful conversation to have. And also another example is like, okay, I'm really struggling to get through to Bob, who's an investor board member. That's a conversation that's probably relevant for the management coach, but maybe even more so for the independent. They can coach you on how to do that. And they can maybe even help to facilitate those conversations.
Do these independent directors get to interact with the other upper management folks, or is it only the CEOs who interact with this director?
I've found it to be really valuable when they do keep in touch. I also think that it's really valuable when the entire board keeps in touch with other teammates. I think it's a great thing for the teammates' career, for their visibility to these influencers. And I think it's a great thing when the board feels like they have access. Transparency relates to the authenticity variable of the trust equation, helps to build trust. It also, that's because there's transparency both ways there. It helps build trust with your team, helps build trust with the investors, for them to be talking directly, not just through you, the CEO. That's a great thing to help build trust. Another thing, though, is you want to build the best company possible. Part of that is getting different points of view out there. And your head of sales may have a very different point of view than you do. Sometimes that'll cause problems when that's shared. But in general, I've really liked that. If you have the trust with the board, like being able for the head of sales to share their opinion directly and for you guys to talk about it, I think it's productive. Now, where those conversations get to be tricky is if it turns into like bad mouthing the company or bad mouthing individuals. And that's where it just gets to be trust. You're hoping that either side helps to flag that if that's where it goes.
The few cases I've heard where they try to keep the distances where there's no trust, that's not a good place to be in.
I was in a conversation, it's funny, with two operators a couple months ago, and one is an independent board member at a $50 billion company that you would know, and the other is the CEO at a $1 billion company. And she was talking about whether or not to bring on an independent and how to work with her board. And there's a completely dysfunctional board relationship. The independent at the $50 billion company was like, the board's responsibility is just to hire and fire the CEO. That's it. Okay, that is a perspective. And there's a lot of very smart people who have that perspective. I don't think that that is a productive perspective for startups. It may be a productive perspective for the $50 billion company that she sits on. But in my case, having other thought partners around the table and facilitating those conversations, building the trust to have productive conversations, I thought was an extremely valuable part of my journey. And I'm excited to do it again when I start my next company.
Yeah. I was having a conversation with Martin Casado from A16Z Advisors, and he was like, I basically try to keep quiet, but then I'm there. When they need any help, I'm always there. Not to interfere with the politics or anything else, but just to help. I think that is the trust we want to build and be productive. I know this is Friday afternoon for you. You've been very patient. Are there topics that we haven't covered about independent directors?
That I can think of? No. I mean, I think there's a lot of good reading out there for folks about independent directors. And I'd recommend talking to a number of CEO and founders that are your friends to hear their thoughts on it as well. This is just one perspective.
That is great advice. Are there people that help you get enlightened on the subject?
Oh, so many. Yeah, I don't even know where to begin. Honestly, I would feel silly even starting. I've been really fortunate to be part of a number of CEO groups. That's been really valuable. We've also had some amazing advisors over the years. I've had some advisors and mentors, some of which have been individual investors in the company. It's not on behalf of VC firms, and some of which are just great advisors. 100+ people I could probably name that have been amazing at this concept.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing your thoughts about independent directors. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure my audience will too. And good luck with everything you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.